Good afternoon. We're here with LD20 Senate candidate Jason Krychiw, and welcome to Insider NJ, sir.
Thanks, Max. I appreciate you having me on.
It's great to have you here. And just wanted to start, if you could, with a little bit about yourself. I know you're a scientist and you're a specialist in uh, viruses. Is that correct? You're a lecturer at Kane. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess in general, kind of going all the way back, I've been involved in the community here for a long time. I'm born and raised in Union in the district here. Went to the public school system here, and then I got my bachelor's and master's degree in microbiology at Rutgers. And so I spent about 6 years there working in a virology lab, working on research science and things like that. In my time as a student, and then as a researcher working in the labs. Um, and then after that, after a couple years of working at Rutgers, an adjunct spot opened up at Kane. So I was doing that for part-time for a little bit, and then eventually got a full-time lecturer position there. So my background, my work experience is very science heavy. I've been involved in the education sector, and I think that those combination of things makes me especially unique for the circumstances, obviously, of what we've been facing for this past year,
Right.
Even a little bit before that with the pandemic, obviously, and kind of our response to that and how we've kind of worked through that the last year.
Mr. Krychiw, maybe we could linger on that for a moment. When you look at the response by the administration and the response by the Democratic majority to this virus, what do you see as perhaps the biggest transgression or failure, or where might have we gone in a different direction, or where might we go now in a different direction that would be more suitable to getting the job done?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in general, honestly, pandemics or viral outbreaks or things dealing with pathology, if you go back, a lot of top researchers and people in the field have said something like this could happen, in the next 5 years or decade or generation, depending on how far you go back. And, I get it on some level. It's hard to envision something like this, maybe when you're not from that background, or there are more pressing matters to deal with at the forefront of everything else going on with government and legislation. But it is definitely one of the areas that I think we should have been more proactive about before this happened. And going forward, I think we have to sort of keep in mind that even when we come out of this pandemic, which I know the vaccines are going out now, and I think New Jersey relatively did an okay job as a state handling things, but obviously we're dealing with shortages of vaccines or availability to people. And just, I think that rollout could have been done better. I mean, I think focusing on, specifically this race and my opponents here, there's been concerning rhetoric about health and safety and
Right.
vaccines
Right.
and things like that. And, I think in general, we could have done a better job putting people at ease about the vaccination program, about testing and the importance of all those kind of things. I think it's hard for people to immediately trust the government when it comes to science, because there is a history there of issues. And I think it becomes even harder when you're trying to build that trust during.
But what do you mean there's a history of issues?
Well, so I mean, not specific to New Jersey. I mean, it's kind of, going back a generation to government vaccination programs, or, availability of healthcare and medicines to certain groups of people that maybe weren't available to marginalized communities, or people who couldn't get involved that way. So there is this hesitation there. I think it's a hesitation, especially in this district, in LD20. It's not quite a majority minority district, but it's close.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of people who have concerns about the vaccine rollout, or if they can take the government's word for something. And again, I'm a scientist. I believe in vaccines. I believe in health and safety. But I definitely think when you have government who doesn't have that background in science, their pitch as to why it's important to get vaccinated, why it's important to get tested even before the vaccine was available, I think you get a case of a politician trying to explain science and public health and things to people, and it doesn't usually go over well because typically people have that mistrust of someone who's political, whereas maybe not so much as someone who comes from a science or a medical background, for example.
Pardon me, but we don't have too many scientists in the state legislature. I can think of
Mm-hmm.
one or two. I can think of fewer than five, perhaps. Have
Yeah, and
you?
I think that's part of the problem. I think if there were more people like me in the state house, where we could be weighing in on these things in real time, we wouldn't have to have this wait and see approach, or maybe have a slower response to things going on. Because listen, I get, we're approaching about a year since really the pandemic kind of started, when things shut down, about last March or April
Right.
time. But back then it was something that for many of us, it's the first time in any of our lifetimes really that we've dealt with something like this, whether you're in government or you're not, any sector like that. So I can understand early on there might be slow actions on things, whether it's the economy or public health and safety or testing. But now that we're kind of approaching the year of it, to me, a lot of that stuff should have been figured out. I mean, especially when it comes to schooling and education. Again, it's the kind of thing where the pandemic hit right in the middle of the school year. Everything kind of just shut down and was at a standstill because no one knew what to expect from it. But then when you get to the end of the typical school year, going over the summer, coming back into fall, it seemed like we still didn't have a lot of answers or planning on how to handle that health. And that's kind of where I think people like me or others who have that background could have really been leaders and at the forefront of saying, this scientifically, data-wise, this is what we should be doing and what we need to be doing.
Not to linger too much on the past, but you raise a good point. I do marvel at the flat-footedness at the outset, the seeming of utter focus on political issues and egos, and the utter lack of preparation for the virus at all levels of government. Really, it just seemed like it was suddenly upon us, like a tidal wave hitting, without any real leadership that prepared the population for a crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you said it best with the egos and things like that too, and how, it was literally a case of a pandemic and a virus being politicized, depending on what side of the aisle maybe somebody was on or what level of government they were at. The response seemed to be very much about personal gain in a lot of cases, or not wanting to act on certain things because, maybe some individuals didn't get help in the past from that person, or they didn't want to lead from the front on an issue that we didn't know about. And, we, in a situation like this where the public is turning towards us for help, we can't be ego driven or timid leaders about it. We needed those voices at the forefront, to your point, to not be flat footed, to at least offer something to the public to let them know that it was being worked on. And I don't think it was there for the longest time. I would argue that for a lot of areas, it maybe still isn't there now.
Mr. Krychiw, could you talk a little bit about the progressive nature of your candidacy? We've touched on it a little bit, but a progressive Democrat, it almost seems like an oxymoron in New Jersey. Where I can understand a machine Democrat in New Jersey, but a progressive Democrat almost seems like something you'd find in Vermont. How is it that your values as a progressive, could you define progressive for me? And then tell me why your values as a progressive are not being served by the incumbent.
Sure. I think really, to me, progressivism is broadly about giving everyone a seat at the table during the decision-making process, especially serving the voices that usually go unheard. People of color and other marginalized communities, younger people, immigrants, whether undocumented or not. I think you see a lot of the times that legislation that gets passed, while it might help some, or it might look good on paper, it doesn't help all, especially those kind of groups. I mean, just as an example, I think with the recent budget that Governor Murphy just announced, on paper, there are definitely a lot of good steps in there. I applaud a decent chunk of what was in that budget for expanded access to childcare and maternal health care and education and things like that. But you still have communities of, nearly 500,000 immigrants in the state who have not gotten any form of pandemic relief or unemployment or anything like that since the start of the pandemic. And a lot of their response was that the budget left them out again, that it didn't really focus specifically on those groups. Same thing with, education, honestly, where, more funding is going to public schools, and that's great. But a lot of the things that are being funded, I would argue, are broken in the first place, and that we really need to do a better job of kind of investing in rebuilding what it means to have equitable schooling, what it means to have equitable access to internet, especially in a time like this pandemic where a lot of the learning was remote. And these are a lot of areas where I think that, the current kind of democratic, the idea of a Democrat in the state is lacking, that these groups are getting left behind a lot. And I think there are, some major tent poles and things that I support, as well as my running mates in the assembly, we're all running as progressive Democrats, that will give more access to people like that. I think, the biggest one is probably, our push to reform the way the ballot is designed, and the whole idea of the ballot line and the deep sort of seated party structure, party chair appointment system that's in New Jersey. I mean, I think it's those underlying.
Pardon me, sir. Are you party to a lawsuit now on that front?
No, not me individually. Just, I guess, to clarify that a bit, I'm the vice chairperson of the Progressive Democrats of New Jersey.
Right.
We, I guess, going back to last summer, an affiliated group with the Progressive Democrats of New Jersey, which was the Progressive Legal Defense Fund of New Jersey, helped to be the primary funder of that of the lawsuit that was filed back then, where Christine Conforti was the plaintiff on the ballot line case. So no, I'm not directly involved in it, but it's definitely something that I support. I think, going back to your question, I think that's a good example of a very foundational issue in the state that keeps younger, more diverse, more progressive left voices out of the conversation, at the ballot box. And I think that's something that we're looking to change, to really make things equitable and open access to everybody in the state.
Let's untangle that a little bit. I just want to ask you first, on the progressive issues front, the incumbent senator in the district certainly could make the case that whether it's the millionaire's tax or legalization of marijuana or a minimum wage hike, that these are all progressive issues accomplished by this establishment Democratic Party and its leadership. And to that, what do you say? He could sit there and actually list these accomplishments. Let's just, for a moment, if you could, take marijuana legalization. This just occurred. Do you see in there something that is just egregiously wrong?
A couple things, honestly. I mean, I would say on that specific issue, number one, that conversation was in the State House back in, I guess, 2019 or around that time is when the bills were first coming up in the State House. And even though we are in a largely blue state, Democrats have the majority in both chambers, they weren't able to get that bill out, and it went to the voters. Where it was overwhelmingly approved, a little over 2-1 there, and so I think that's an example where the state and the people who were live in New Jersey clearly wanted that, and yet the Democrat majority in the State House wasn't able to get it done. So to me, it's something where there's a break in the chain there. If the constituents, and it wasn't just like a portion of the state, I think in every county, more or less, it was about a 65 to 70% yes vote to legalizing marijuana. So that should mean that every constituency for every legislature in the State House, more or less, was overwhelmingly for this. And yet the legislatures themselves couldn't get this deal done. So I would say, if they were truly progressive on that issue, we would have had this legalized 2-3 years ago, not just now. Because those 2 years weren't just a delay in the tax revenue or it being legal. It was how many thousands or tens of thousands of people got arrested because of that. and are charged or fined or imprisoned. And that goes back again to my whole thing where I think true progressives have that in mind at the forefront. And if that was me in the state house, there's no question that I'm pushing for that to pass through the chambers back then, not saying, well, let's give it 2 or 3 years and put it to a vote and see what happens. There's a sense of urgency, I think, for a lot of people who identify as progressives with issues like that, where maybe people looking at it from a top-down view think we can wait or feet can be dragged on it. But if you're someone whose family has been impacted by the war on drugs, saying, well, we'll have a vote on this in 2 years isn't enough. That means that you could have people going to prison or worse because they were involved in that over policing and kind of the war on drugs, like I said. So just kind of using that specific issue, I do think we're lagging behind it. I mean, especially when you look at all the other states in the country that had already legalized it to that point. I mean, I think to name some off, Montana, this true red state, was able to get marijuana legalized before New Jersey. And so I don't think anyone can sit there and call themselves a progressive if that's the kind of timeline that we're looking at. And then I think this most recent the version that just got passed. I mean, I know there's a lot of like cleanup bills and other bills on the table about it, but I think it left a lot out. Things about homegrown marijuana and things like that. I just think the whole process took way too long, and I think if we had truly progressive, forward-thinking legislators, it wouldn't have ended up like that.
If you were in the Senate now, what would be the first cleanup bill you would introduce? Where would you jump in immediately?
Honestly, probably the homegrown thing. I know I just use that as the example, but I think because so many other states that have legalized it, I think every other one, if I'm not mistaken, have homegrown already as part of it. I know the amount would vary depending on the state or the territory. But I've seen, since it's been legalized, even this vote this past week, a lot of people having the misconception that they can grow at home. And so I foresee that even though, marijuana is legal now in the state, I still foresee that as an avenue where people might still be getting arrested or fined or whatever else. I think those things that are going to impact home life and the criminal justice aspect of it need to be addressed first and foremost. So that's probably the first one. I would say if that's the 1A one. The 1B one is that I think there needs to be more specificity in the earmarks for where the revenue from all this is going to go. Because if I recall correctly, in the initial bill that was was out after the vote occurred, the only actual 2 specific earmarks for spending were for police and kind of retraining police on how to deal with cannabis and everything dealing with that. And then everything else is going to the Cannabis Regulatory Committee to then be determined where that's going to go from then. And I think if you kind of look back in recent history at things like the gas tax hike and things like that, where it's supposed to go specifically to infrastructure or go specifically to this place or another, we don't actually see huge improvements or leaps and bounds in the spending from those revenues. And I'm worried that cannabis will be just another example of that, where, as a state, if done correctly, we're going to see an increase in revenue here. What are we doing besides saying, on paper or in practice, these are going to go to underserved communities or, businesses that and business owners who have been impacted by the war on drugs. I'm not seeing enough specificity to make sure those things are being tackled. And that's something that I'd make sure is specifically laid out. Like, where is this money going and how is it helping the people who have been most impacted by the war on drugs?
Sir, you mentioned the foundational issue of the ballot itself, and it goes to the heart of party politics and how people who serve at various levels of government participate in a system which ultimately winnows out those who do not advance and rewards those with offices like Senate who do move forward. And what do you think about that process in the Democratic Party? What about it do you object to most strenuously?
Oh, well, I think it has to do a little bit with what you said about how, kind of this process that you go through, and that if you make it through it, it's, you're, quote unquote rewarded with an office usually, because typically, if you get the county endorsement or the endorsement from the party, regardless of the level, you do see that that voter bump just from being on the line or having the resources of the party. Um, and if you don't kind of get through that process, you are indirectly punished because you don't have an opportunity in some cases to maybe get the coverage or the resources or the exposure you might get just by kind of being placed on that line. I think it drowns out a lot of voices, again, of marginalized communities, younger people, people of color, um, who there is this urgency for fairer wages and affordable housing, tackling environmental issues. I mean, we could go on all the issues, but I think the idea to me of a group of people sitting in a room essentially deciding who is going to be the next senator or assembly person, or in some cases, governor, depending on how the different counties kind of align,
Right.
by awarding them the line, isn't how a functioning democracy works. In 2019, which is the last time that the county committee seats were up in Union County, where I'm in, we ran a slate in my town here in Union, and we were able to win 15 seats off the line, which was, a fraction of the total seats in the entire county. But at the same time, it was the largest offline win, I believe, of any municipality in Union County in that primary, just because it is so difficult. And, we, I think, are really doing a good job serving our community and kind of representing the progressive wing of the party by having that voice in there. But it's still such a minor voice, that these decisions can be made, again, by that kind of backroom dealing small group of people, where maybe the best candidates aren't the ones who advance to get that endorsement or who get on that line or who get elected. It's the ones who go along to get along, or the ones who say yes to the people making those decisions. And I think that's the biggest problem.
Mr. Krychiw, what would you say to that skeptic who looks at you and says, well, I like him, he's a good candidate, but he hasn't served an elected office yet, so I don't have any sense of a record. And maybe he should serve at the local level before taking on a challenge like state senate. What would you say to that person in the way of making an argument for your unique capacities?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were saying before. Even if you just want to focus on the pandemic for a bit, where I think had we had someone more like me with my experience, as you said, I think there's one or two people who might have a background either in medicine or research, so it's not no one, but clearly based on the last year, it's not enough. And that people who have been in the legislature for 10, 20, 30 years weren't able to successfully, in my opinion, navigate us through this pandemic. Like I said earlier, I would say relatively, we've done an okay job, but by no stretch of the imagination have we done a good job. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you're going to take an example of a pandemic and say, this is probably the most urgent issue that we faced in a generation, and a lot of the legislators who have that experience couldn't get it done,
right?
What does that experience mean then? Mm-hmm. So I would say that in a lot of ways, kind of coming from a background of, professionally being an educator, and being a scientist, I do have a lot of experience on the education and the research front, which are two of the biggest sectors in the state that probably, I think, in my opinion, need attention. I've come from organizing spaces. As I mentioned, I'm the vice chairperson of the Progressive Democrats of New Jersey, which is a statewide progressive group, and we organize in counties throughout the entire state. And so, I haven't been in the state house, casting votes on things, but I think that my record and my stances on the issues are pretty clear if you look at things I've advocated for or been active about. Even going back to my experience, like I mentioned, running for local office, whether it was for county committee or local town council or things like that. I think the reason we've had success here is because that message of having someone who's not this typical politician who is younger, but that's okay because I bring these new ideas and these progressive values. That's what people have responded to. I think it's why, again, we had that success with the Union County Democrat Committee, which typically you don't, crack that line that much to win 15 seats off of it. So, I think we have had success, like I've said, and it's not to say that this race is not going to be uphill again because of the incumbent senator Ryan likely to get the line here and have that party endorsement and that backing. It's not to say that isn't a hill to overcome, but we've gone up against that before in Union, where both of us are from. He is the party chairperson here, the Democratic Party chair. And so, I haven't gone up against him directly before, but through the county committee or running for town council or even, running people for Board of Education here, kind of non-politically connected types, the movement we've built here has seen success. We've won seats consistently over the last year or two. So I think if you look at this race from outside the district, it might seem a little bit like a foregone conclusion, just based on how elections usually go in the rest of the state. But I think if you were to really take a deep dive in here into kind of my organizing experience, my activism experience, being front and center on the issues, we have that success here.
That's a good point. There is some groundwork laid. It's not as though you're just jumping in as someone that hasn't held elected office. You've been involved politically at the local level. So let's talk a little bit, though, about the dynamics of this primary, because they're complicated by a second challenger in the race, a challenger that has some name ID, Assemblyman Holly, who's not returning on the line, and is also opposing the incumbent senator. How do you break through what appears to be a collision course between these two recognized, and I realize we're going to touch on some of what you just said. You're putting in place a grassroots movement, but will it not be difficult to penetrate through Holly versus crime?
I actually believe it's the opposite. If you kind of break down the election math, or at least the presumed election math, where, let's just say, kind of take an average of how usually offline challengers will do. I mean, we could even just use, last year, I supported a group of candidates who ran off the line for, then freeholder, now commissioner, and sheriff, county clerk, local candidates. And so we ran a slate in Union County, which is obviously difficult given that it was sort of at the beginnings of the pandemic. We couldn't do a lot of campaigning, but to your point, kind of the foundation and the grassroots we had built just kind of in this district, honestly, because it's where I'm from, and a lot of other people part of the organization are from Elizabeth, which are the two largest towns in this district. We were able to get 30% of the vote, give or take, in the primaries last year. So even if you assume no extra work being done, it's just me and Senator Cryan, and it's a 70-30 split. Now you get someone like Assemblyman Holly who's running, who I think has a lot of those same connections, and that roll in a lot of the same circles that the incumbent senator does, being that they were both party endorsed candidates who got the line for several terms. Even if he takes his own 25-30% or whatever it might be, I think a majority of that would come from that typical line vote, what the incumbent would get. So now instead of a 70-30 split, you're looking at a 45-30, 25, 40-30-30. I think it actually becomes a much closer race. The fact that we have all these, we have three candidates running. And, like we were saying before, it's not like me or even my running mates in the assembly are coming out of nowhere. We actually currently are the only full slate of announced state candidates in the district. Obviously there's Assemblywoman Quijano, but there's no other assembly candidate yet. I'm not sure if there'll be 6 total in this district, who knows. But I think the fact that we present this united front already, the fact that we, in years leading up to this, have been active in the community politically and civically and organizationally, that voting group who is tired of the same old politics and the people who have served us before who haven't gotten the job done, whether it's been 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I think those are the people who are going to galvanize around our ticket. And it actually gives us a better shot to win, probably if it was just a straight up race between offline progressives and a more solidified county line.
Why couldn't you and Assemblyman Holly come to an agreement? If he was going to be ejected, it seems natural to consider an alliance of some kind. And why couldn't that occur? Did you make any effort in that regard?
I mean, talking about, him being ejected from the line, I can't really speak to, if that was writing on the wall or if that was going to happen. I don't know if he just decided to run or if he decided to run because that was in the pipeline for him.
Right.
So, I can't really speak to that part specifically. But, I would say there are similarities in some ways between some of the things. I know we're both born and raised in this district, and we are, I think, more community-minded people than maybe Senator Cryan, or at least I would consider myself that way. Mm-hmm. And so I do think in some ways it speaks to the same constituency of people. But I do think there are certain issues that we differ on that are very important to people that I would represent, or to even me personally. Like we talked about
vaccinations primarily.
Yeah, so that given my background, that is a big thing for me. I mean, it is who I am, kind of coming from this background of health and safety and research science. So I would say that's one of them. And then we talked about the whole issue of the ballot line before. I mean, I think anyone who's kind of been elected and served in the assembly or the Senate, and who maybe now is speaking up a little bit more about it because they aren't benefiting from it currently. Mm-hmm. But in that role, weren't speaking out against it. I mean, I think that is for progressives and progressive in this district is a really big issue. And the fact that me and my running mates, Ricky and Isa, and our group have been kind of against that for years now. I mean, I think those are just two examples of big things that we wanted to run this unapologetic, unabashed campaign about progressivism and fighting up for these things. And I, to me, I don't want to compromise my values or what I think the people in this district deserve or need to make alliances or make really backroom deals with anybody.
Understood. So if you were elected to the state Senate, what would the reform legislation on ballots look like from a Senator Krychiw?
I think it's just as simple as, as far as, an immediate thing, just making ballots, what are so-called bubble ballots, where the offices are grouped by, or the people are grouped by office, not by kind of the party line endorsement. Mm-hmm. So you would have a collection of people running for state Senate, separate from people running for assembly, separate from people running for any county positions, which I think would immediately force some more accountability and transparency. People have to run on their own merit now because they don't get to benefit from them saying, vote for Joe Biden and the real Democrats in his line. Or what we'll likely see this year is vote for Phil Murphy and the real Democrats in his line. I think people ride coattails a lot, and they get people to try to vote for a letter or a number more than an individual or what they might stand for on the ballot. So yeah, I think bubble balloting would be a big step. I know there's even been talk or introductions of bills to get ranked choice voting as something in New Jersey, sure. Which is something that I would support. I think it's a good alternative to not only get rid of the ballot line system, but I think it does help more than two people try to run for a race without eating into other votes, or maybe not getting people who would normally be able to run or kind of get some attention, get those votes and get some notoriety that way. So I think those are maybe the first two things I would look at tackling to fix the balloting system in New Jersey.
I'd like to ask you this too. Over the years, the Green Party had some energy, particularly 20 years ago with Ralph Nader running for president. And in more recent years, Bernie Sanders has coalesced the movement nationally within the Democratic Party. And have you thought at all about the Green Party as an alternative? What was the primary reason that you've stuck with the Democrats as opposed to examining the possibility of the Green Party option?
Well, I think part of it is like we were just talking about, with just like simply the way elections work and the process works right now. coming into, at that point would be a general election as a true third party, especially with the way the ballot is designed in New Jersey, is very hard to kind of get out of the gate. I also think that, running as a progressive Democrat, or, maybe with someone might identify themselves as like a leftist, or, whatever you want to kind of describe their ideology as.
Right.
I think it's because on paper, the foundational ideas of a Democrat are not inherently bad, but then when you start to get into the actual policies of all those things, they become that way. And I think that's where the progressivism comes in. Like we talk about housing and, Democratic focus on like more equitable housing and things like that. And if you look at, which I think anyone who's kind of left of center would agree with, more affordable housing, more access to housing as a human right for people. But then you look at the policies that kind of come out of that platform piece, and it's, whatever it is, legislation that makes 5% of a luxury apartment affordable housing, where, someone like me who is progressive and more left-leaning would look at that and say, why don't we have entire complexes of livable housing and affordable housing for people rather than kind of doing the bare minimum? And that's kind of what I think, progressivism is. It's actually being proactive and making progress on these democratic ideals rather than kind of settling for the bare minimum or throwing people a bone to satisfy the bare minimum needs, but not making sure that everyone's needs are met.
Mr. Krychiw, I want to thank you for a substantive and thoughtful discussion, and I do want to do this again. I'd actually love to dive deeper into the issues. Let's take 5 or 6 issues and really analyze them, and maybe we can do it in the next month or so. And certainly look forward to talking to your running mates as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to dive into some of those issues. I know we were heavy on a lot of, pandemic things and then marijuana and the ballot. But yeah, I mean, like I alluded to before, I think there are just, there's a laundry list of issues, honestly, that I think urgently need to be addressed in the state. And so, yeah, I would, thank you for having me on today and talking with you. It was a great conversation. And I definitely look forward to coming back and, having my running mates come and talk more about some of our policies and our plans for the state.
It's a great pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Max. Appreciate it.